I always thought Daniel and I were happy. We were married for 5 years, and everything felt good. We had small problems, but we always worked together. He smiled when he saw me. He laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. He remembered little things about me, like my favorite flower or my favorite color. But now, something is different. It started with small things. Daniel would forget where he left his wallet or phone. I thought it was normal. Everyone forgets sometimes. But then he forgot bigger things. One day, he came home late from work. He did not call me to tell me. I waited, and I was worried. When he came home, he looked confused. He said he thought he told me. Later, he forgot my birthday. It was the first time ever. I made a nice dinner. I waited for him to say something, but he didn't. I thought maybe he was tired. But as the night went on, I realized he didn't remember. I felt hurt. I didn't know why he forgot. Was he too busy? Was something wrong? I asked myself again and again, but I didn't have an answer. I tried harder after that. I wanted to remind him how much I loved him. I cooked his favorite meals. I cleaned the house more. I smiled more, even when I was sad. I thought maybe I was not enough for him. Maybe I was too boring, too simple. Maybe he didn't love me like before. But it didn't help. Daniel became more distant. He stayed quiet during dinner. He spent more time alone in his office. When I tried to talk to him, he just nodded and didn't really listen. Sometimes it felt like I was living with a stranger. The worst moment came one evening. I made his favorite food, a special dish I always cooked for him. I was excited to see him smile. But when I put it on the table, he looked at it and asked, "What is this?" I froze. He didn't even recognize it. I wanted to cry, but I held it in. I told myself it was just a mistake. Maybe he was tired or stressed. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about us. I remembered the early days of our marriage. We were so happy. We laughed a lot. We traveled. We dreamed about the future. But now it felt like all of that was gone. I wondered if I did something wrong. Maybe I wasn't a good wife. Maybe I was the problem. I got up and walked to the living room. I opened an old photo album. I looked at pictures of us smiling on vacations, at family parties, and on our wedding day. We looked so happy. I touched the pictures and felt tears in my eyes. I wanted that happiness back. As I looked at the photos, I realized something else. Daniel looked happy too, but now he wasn't. His eyes didn't shine like before. His smile was smaller, almost gone. It wasn't just me who was unhappy. He was too. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. I felt lost. I felt alone. And I felt scared. That was when I saw it. On his desk in the corner of the room, there was a notebook. It was closed, but something about it caught my attention. I walked over and opened it. Inside, I saw his handwriting. At the top of the first page, it said, "Do not forget Elena. She is your wife." My heart stopped. I read the words again and again. Why would Daniel write this? Why would he need to remind himself about me? As I turned the pages, I saw more notes. They were short sentences, all about me and our life together. Elena loves flowers. She likes to paint. We are married 5 years. Each note was simple, but it felt like he was trying to remember things about me. I closed the notebook and sat down. I felt shocked. I felt hurt. But most of all, I felt confused. Why was this happening? Why was Daniel writing these notes? I stayed in the chair for a long time. I didn't have the answers, but I knew this was not just about me. This was something bigger. Something was wrong with Daniel, and I had to find out what it was. The next day, I woke up feeling heavy. My heart was full of questions, but I did not know where to start. I thought about the notebook all morning. The words inside it played in my mind again and again. Why would Daniel need to write those notes? Was he forgetting things on purpose? Or was something else wrong? I couldn't talk to him about it. I didn't know what to say. And even if I asked, what would he tell me? Would he admit something was wrong? Or would he just stay quiet like he always did now? The distance between us felt so wide, and I didn't know how to close it. I tried to act normal. I made breakfast and cleaned the house. I stayed busy to stop myself from thinking too much. But even as I worked, I felt like a part of me was missing. I wanted to be close to Daniel again, but it felt impossible. Later that day, I looked at our wedding photos again. I remembered how we used to laugh and share everything. I wondered where all that had gone. I blamed myself. I thought, maybe I am not good enough. Maybe I am not interesting anymore. I started to change myself. I thought if I was better, Daniel would come back to me. I made sure the house was perfect. I cooked the best meals I could. I wore nice clothes, even if we were just at home. I smiled more, even when I felt sad. But nothing changed. Daniel stayed quiet. He did not notice the little things I did. He came home from work and went straight to his office. At night, he sat next to me, but it felt like we were miles apart. The hardest part was not knowing why. I kept thinking, maybe it's my fault. Maybe I am boring. Maybe I did something wrong. I wanted to ask him, but I was scared. What if he said yes? What if he told me he didn't love me anymore? I started to feel very lonely. Even when Daniel was home, I felt alone. It was like he wasn't really there. I couldn't sleep at night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things I did wrong. One day, my best friend Mia came to visit. She saw that I wasn't myself. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her a little. I didn't tell her everything, but I said that Daniel had changed. He wasn't the same, and I didn't know why. Mia told me I needed to take care of myself. She said I should try to do things that make me happy. She told me to think about my painting, something I hadn't done in years. But I couldn't think about that. How could I paint when my heart was breaking? After Mia left, I felt worse. I thought, she doesn't understand. She doesn't know how hard this is. But deep down, I knew she was right. I needed to do something for myself. I needed to feel strong again. That night, I went to Daniel's office. I saw the notebook on his desk again. My hands shook as I picked it up. I opened it and read the notes one more time. Each page had little sentences about me, about us. It was like he was trying to remember everything about our life together. I closed the notebook and sat down. I thought about what I should do. Should I tell him I found it? Should I ask him why he wrote those notes? Or should I stay quiet? I was scared of the answers, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to know why Daniel was forgetting, and I needed to find out if I could help him. As I sat there, I made a decision. I was going to figure this out, even if it hurt. I was going to find out the truth about why my husband was slipping away from me. The next morning, I made an appointment with Daniel's doctor. I didn't tell him about it. I wanted answers, but I didn't know how to talk to him about what I found in the notebook. My heart felt heavy as I waited for the day to come. I kept thinking, maybe this is nothing. Maybe I am making it worse in my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Something was wrong, and I had to know what it was. When I arrived at the doctor's office, I felt nervous. My hands shook as I sat in the chair. I told the doctor everything I had noticed. How Daniel forgot little things at first, but now he forgot bigger things like important dates and memories. I told her about the notebook and the notes he wrote to himself about me. The doctor listened and asked me questions. Then she explained that Daniel might have early onset memory loss. She said this is a condition where a person starts to lose their memory before they are old. She said it is not very common, but it can happen. I sat there, feeling like the world had stopped. Memory loss. The words felt so big and heavy. I asked her what it meant for Daniel and for us. She said his memory would get worse over time. He might forget more things, not just about me, but about his own life. She said he might need more help as it got worse. I thanked her and left the office, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I walked to my car and sat there for a long time. I tried to understand what she told me, but it was too much. My husband was forgetting me. One day, he might not remember me at all. When I got home, I felt lost. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. I thought about Daniel and how he must feel. He knew this was happening. That was why he wrote the notes. He didn't tell me because he didn't want me to know. That night, something happened that broke my heart even more. Daniel came into the kitchen while I was cooking. He looked at me, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. He asked me who I was. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I told him my name. I told him I was his wife. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he still didn't understand. It felt like someone had taken a piece of my heart and crushed it. I went to the bathroom and cried quietly. I didn't want him to hear me. The next morning, I decided I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit and wait for him to forget everything. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. I started reading about memory loss and how to make life easier for someone who has it. I learned that routine and reminders can help. I wrote little notes and put them around the house. On the bathroom mirror, I wrote, "This is your wife, Elena." On the kitchen table, I wrote, "Today is Monday. There is tea in the cupboard." I hoped these notes would make things less confusing for him. At first, Daniel didn't say much about the notes. He would look at them, read them, and then walk away. But one day, he smiled at one of the notes. It was a small smile, but it was the first smile I had seen from him in a long time. Seeing him smile gave me a little hope. I thought, Maybe I can help him remember. Maybe we can still have good days together. I started to feel a little stronger, even though I still felt sad. As the days went by, I tried to focus on the small things. I reminded him of happy memories from our past. I showed him photos of our trips and our wedding. Sometimes he remembered, other times he didn't, but I kept trying. Even when it was hard, I told myself I wouldn't give up. I loved Daniel, and I wanted to hold on to the love we shared, even if he couldn't remember it all the time. But deep down, I was still afraid. I knew this was only the beginning, and the hardest days were yet to come. After I started leaving notes for Daniel, life became a little calmer. He didn't ask me who I was anymore because there was always a note to remind him. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. He seemed less confused, and I could see that he felt a little more at peace. I began to write more notes, not just about who I was or where things were, but about small details from our life. I wrote things like, "You love coffee with 2 sugars. Your favorite movie is the one we watched on our first date." I hope these little reminders would help him hold on to pieces of himself and our life together. One day, while Daniel was at work, I cleaned out a drawer in the living room. Inside, I found my old paintbrushes and paints. I hadn't touched them in years. Before we got married, I loved to paint. It made me feel happy and free. But after we got married, life got busy and I stopped. I picked up a brush and held it in my hand. It felt strange, but also familiar. That night, after Daniel went to bed, I took out the paints and started to work. I didn't know what to paint at first. I just let the brush move on the canvas. Slowly, I saw shapes and colors come together. It wasn't perfect, but it felt good. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something for myself. The next morning, Daniel saw the painting. He looked at it for a long time and then he smiled. He asked if I made it, and I told him I did. He said it was beautiful. Then he asked if he had met the artist before. My heart broke a little, but I smiled and said yes, he had. I started to paint more often. Every night, after Daniel went to sleep, I sat at the table with my brushes and let my feelings come out in colors. Sometimes I painted things from our past, like the little cafe where we used to sit and talk for hours. Other times, I painted the things I was afraid of, like dark clouds or an empty chair. Painting helped me in a way I didn't expect. It gave me a place to put all the sadness and fear I felt. It didn't make the pain go away, but it made it easier to carry. And when I showed my paintings to Daniel, even if he didn't always understand them, he always smiled. But even as I found small moments of peace, Daniel's memory kept getting worse. One evening, he came into the kitchen and looked around like he didn't know where he was. He asked me why he was there. I reminded him that this was our home, and he nodded, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. It hurt to see him like this, but I reminded myself that it wasn't his fault. He wasn't choosing to forget. This was something he couldn't control. I told myself that all I could do was be patient and love him, even on the hardest days. As time went on, I started to notice more changes. Daniel became quieter. He didn't talk about his day like he used to. He stopped asking questions about mine. Sometimes he would just sit and stare at the wall. Other times, he would get upset because he couldn't remember something. I tried to stay strong, but it was hard. I felt like I was losing him little by little. I missed the man who used to make me laugh, who used to surprise me with flowers, who used to hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay. Now, I was the one who had to be strong, the one who had to hold us both together. One evening, I sat down with a blank canvas. I wanted to paint something, but I didn't know what. I thought about our life, about everything we had been through, and about the man Daniel used to be. Then I picked up my brush and started to paint. When I was finished, I looked at the canvas. It was a picture of two hands holding each other. One hand was strong and steady, while the other was weak and shaking. It made me cry because it felt so true. This was what our life had become. The next morning, I showed the painting to Daniel. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned to me and said it was beautiful. For a moment, I thought he understood what it meant. But then he asked me whose hands they were. I told him they were ours. He smiled and said he liked that. Even though the days were hard, I kept painting. It was my way of holding on to who I was, even as everything around me changed. And in those small moments when Daniel smiled or remembered something, I felt like we were still connected, even if it was just for a little while. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I also knew I wasn't ready to give up. I loved Daniel, and I would keep fighting for him, for us, for as long as I could. The days felt heavier as time passed. Daniel's memory became worse. He started forgetting more than just small details. He forgot places, faces, and even how to do simple things. One morning, he didn't remember how to tie his shoes. He sat there, staring at them, looking lost. I knelt down and tied them for him. He thanked me like I was a stranger helping him, and it broke my heart. I learned to expect the unexpected. Sometimes, Daniel would call me by a name I didn't know. Other times, he would pack a bag and say he needed to go home. I would gently tell him that he was home, but he would look at me like he didn't believe me. Those moments were the hardest. It was as if he was drifting further and further away from the life we built together. One evening, I was making dinner when I heard a crash. I ran to the living room and found Daniel standing next to a broken vase. He looked scared and confused. He said he didn't know what happened. I told him it was okay and cleaned up the pieces. But after that, I started to worry about leaving him alone, even for a short time. I decided to make the house safer for him. I moved things out of his way, put notes on more doors and drawers, and hid anything that could hurt him if he used it wrong. I also began staying home more. I stopped going out with friends or doing things just for myself. I felt guilty for leaving him, even for a little while. One night, as I sat beside him on the couch, I realized how much my life had changed. I used to be full of energy and dreams. Now I felt like my world was smaller. It was just me and Daniel, and I was the one keeping everything together. Sometimes I felt like I was disappearing, like I was losing myself. But I couldn't let myself fall apart. Daniel needed me. He didn't say it, but I could see it in his eyes. He depended on me to remind him who he was, where he was, and that he was loved. I told myself that as long as I could do that for him, I was still enough. One day, I found an old journal I used to write in. I hadn't opened it in years. As I flipped through the pages, I saw notes about happy times with Daniel. I read about the first trip we took together, the day we got married, and the time he surprised me with a picnic in the park. Reading those memories made me smile, but it also made me cry. I realized how much of our life was slipping away. I decided to write in the journal again. This time, I wrote about what was happening now. I wrote about Daniel's struggles, my fears, and the small moments of joy we still shared. Writing in the journal helped me feel less alone. It gave me a place to put my thoughts and feelings, the ones I couldn't always say out loud. I began to carry it with me everywhere. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I would write in it. One evening, I decided to show the journal to Daniel. I opened it to a page where I had written about a happy memory. I read it to him, hoping it would spark something in his mind. When I finished, he looked at me and smiled. He said it sounded like a nice story. I asked if he remembered it, and he shook his head. I felt a pang of sadness, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I told him that it was okay. I said that even if he couldn't remember, I would remember for both of us. He nodded and said that was good. After that, I started reading to him from the journal more often. Sometimes he would listen quietly. Other times, he would close his eyes and fall asleep. Even though he didn't always understand, it felt like we were sharing something special. As Daniel's memory continued to fade, I began to feel the weight of everything more deeply. I miss the man he used to be. I miss the way he would make me laugh, the way he would hold me, and the way he would make me feel like everything was going to be okay. Now, I was the one who had to be strong. I had to be the one to say that everything would be okay, even when I wasn't sure it would be. I had to remind myself that love wasn't just about the good times. It was about staying even when it was hard. One night, as I sat by Daniel's side, I looked at his face. He was sleeping peacefully, and for a moment, he looked like the man I fell in love with. I reached out and held his hand. It was warm and familiar, and it reminded me that even though so much had changed, some things were still the same. I promised myself that no matter what happened, I would keep holding on to those small moments. They were like little lights in the darkness, and they gave me the strength to keep going. Even if Daniel couldn't remember our love, I would remember it for both of us. The days felt like they were blending into each other. I woke up, took care of Daniel, and went to bed each night wondering if the next day would be harder. His memory loss was almost complete now. Most days, he didn't recognize me at all. He would look at me with empty eyes, and I would have to remind him who I was. I kept writing in the journal, not just for myself, but for him too. I wanted to capture everything, what we had, what we lost, and the little moments we still shared. Even if Daniel couldn't remember, I wanted to believe that somewhere deep inside, he could feel the love we once had. One day, as I sat with him on the couch, I showed him a photo album. It was full of pictures from our life together. I pointed to each one and told him the story behind it. There was a picture of us on our wedding day, smiling and holding hands. I told him how happy we were. Then there was a picture of us at the beach, laughing as the waves touched our feet. I told him how much fun we had that day. Daniel looked at the pictures, but his face didn't change. It was like he was looking at strangers. I felt tears come to my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I kept talking, hoping that something would spark a memory. Later that evening, as I cleaned up the kitchen, I heard a noise. I turned around and saw Daniel holding the journal. He was flipping through the pages, his eyes moving slowly over the words. I froze, unsure of what to do. Then he looked up at me. For the first time in weeks, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. He said my name softly, and my heart skipped a beat. I walked over to him and sat down. He held the journal up to me and asked if it was mine. I told him yes, it was. He said the words inside felt familiar. He didn't know why, but they made him feel warm, like he wasn't alone. I told him they were stories of our life together, stories I wrote so we could remember. He nodded and smiled, and for a moment, it felt like I had my husband back. That night, I sat beside him and read more from the journal. He listened quietly, and though I wasn't sure if he understood everything, I could see that he was calm. It was a small moment, but it meant everything to me. In the days that followed, I noticed little changes. Daniel still forgot things, but he seemed more at ease. I kept reading to him from the journal and showing him the pictures. Sometimes he would smile or nod, and I took those small reactions as a sign that he was still with me in some way. One afternoon, as we sat outside in the garden, Daniel reached for my hand. It was something he hadn't done in a long time. He held it gently, and I looked at him in surprise. He didn't say anything, but his touch said enough. It reminded me of the man he used to be, the man who loved me deeply. As the weeks went by, I accepted that our life would never go back to the way it was. But I also learned to find joy in the present. I stopped focusing on what we lost and started cherishing what we still had. A smile, a moment of clarity, a gentle touch. These became my treasures. I knew Daniel's condition would only get worse, but I told myself I would keep loving him through it all. I would hold on to the memories, even if he couldn't. I would carry the weight for both of us, because that's what love is. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned pink, I sat with Daniel and read to him again. I told him about the time we danced in the rain, how he spun me around and laughed like a child. He didn't remember, but he smiled, and that was enough. As I closed the journal, I looked at him and realized something important. Even though his mind was fading, his heart was still here. The love we shared was still alive, even if it was in a different form. That night, I wrote one last entry in the journal. I wrote about the journey we had been on, the pain and the joy, the loss and the love. I wrote about how, even in the hardest moments, we found a way to hold on to each other. Daniel may not remember me tomorrow, but I will remember him. And in my heart, I will carry us both for as long as I can.